Christina obediently followed Lori along the dark corridor, feeling the cold moisture from her clothes gradually being absorbed into her skin. The smell of antiseptics and old walls mixed with a slight taste of dampness, creating an atmosphere that felt not only sterile, but also strangely isolated. "What kind of surprise?" Christina finally asked, trying to make out her friend's expression in the dim light. "If I tell you now, it won't be a surprise," Lori smiled slyly, slapping her on the shoulder. "You'll see for yourself." When they reached the elective surgery department, they stopped at a massive metal door with peeling paint. Lori took the key card out of her pocket and swiped it on the reader. The lock clicked and the door opened with a quiet creak. "Welcome to your new kingdom," Lori declared with pathos, motioning for Christina to come inside. The hall they entered was empty and a bit deserted. The lighting burned alternately, creating a play of shadows on the walls. The doors of rooms with metal numbers stretched along the long corridor. Lori pointed at them. "This is where you will be. 6 chambers, as I already said. The patients are mostly stable and almost all are asleep. But the last room," Lori pointed to the door at the very end of the corridor, "is a little special." Christina frowned. "Special? How is that?" "There's a woman who, well, she's a little strange. Her name is Mrs. Carlyle. Her surgery went without complications, but doctors say she had unusual reactions to medications. Sometimes she mutters something strange in her sleep. They say it's a side effect. But honestly, I think she's just a little weird." "Wonderful," Christina remarked sarcastically, taking off her wet jacket and throwing it over her arm. "First the rain, then the dungeon, and now a patient with special needs. My night is just wonderful." Lori laughed, slapping her on the back. "Don't be dramatic. Everything will be fine. You're an experienced nurse. You can handle it." Christina sighed heavily and, straightening her shoulders, headed to the door of the first aid station to change clothes and prepare everything she needed for the night shift. Lori slowly led Christina through the next block of reports, carefully entering each room with her. At the same time, she spoke almost in a whisper, explaining everything that needed to be known about the patients, their conditions, and the necessary care. Working in tandem, they were both so well coordinated that sometimes no words were even required. Many years of experience made itself felt. After all, both already had 10 years of professional nursing careers behind them. They graduated from medical school together and almost immediately got a job at the same hospital. When they first met, Christina was already married a young and slightly naive wife. It was a time of hopes and dreams when everything ahead seemed so simple and clear. Lori, on the contrary, was always lonely. She never rushed into the whirlpool of personal relationships and devoted her free time either to work or to herself. Nevertheless, their friendship developed quickly and firmly, turning into a reliable shoulder for each other. As they left Ward 5, Lori finally noticed that Christina looked depressed. An anxious look, a tired expression on his face, it was striking. Lori stopped and looked closely at her friend. Thoughts wandered. How long did this last? Was it in the morning or for several days already? "What happened, Chris?" she asked quietly, coming closer and hugging her friend tightly and warmly. "Is Dennis acting like a jerk again?" Christina sighed and nodded, as if she was admitting something painful. "He keeps threatening to leave me," she answered dully, shaking her head. "I don't know what to do with him anymore. It's getting harder every day." Lori exhaled, holding back a wave of indignation. She knew that Dennis had never been a good husband to Christina. These threats, mood swings, and constant quarrels, all this lasted for years. "Let him go," Lori said firmly, looking straight into her friend's eyes. "You are so beautiful and smart. He just doesn't understand what he has." She let go of the hug, but immediately took Christina's hands to reinforce her words. "Hold on, okay? You can always come to me. Always." Christina smiled faintly, and for a moment a glimpse of the former liveliness appeared in her eyes. "Thank you, Lori. I can handle it. Everything will be fine." Lori looked at her carefully for a couple more seconds, as if checking whether her words really reached their goal. She then lightly patted Christina's hand and a small smile appeared on her face. "Well, now to your last room for today," she said in a cheerful tone, lifting her friend's mood. With each word, her smile grew wider until she pointed to the door to their left. "You'll definitely like this patient." Christina raised her eyebrows in slight surprise. "Is it true? Why is this?" Lori squinted slyly and bowed her head. "He's 28. He's a fireman. Can you imagine? A fireman who was most likely rescuing children and old people from a burning house or something like that." She spoke with such enthusiasm that Christina couldn't help but smile. "So?" she asked with interest, tilting her head slightly. "He had a large hernia, which required him to have 2 operations. Now he will spend a couple of days here. Your task is to make sure that he does not move, does not lift anything heavy. Well, in general, everything is standard." Christina rolled her eyes but chuckled. "Is there anything interesting in this?" Lori, not paying attention to her slight irony, continued in an artificially mysterious tone. "He has just been transferred from the operating room, and he is still on drugs. So there's not a sound from him all night. You won't even notice he's there." Raising her eyebrows, Christina could barely restrain herself from laughing. Lori carefully opened the door, putting a finger to her lips to remind her to be quiet. When the women entered the room, a light rustle of footsteps broke the silence of the room. The patient, lying in a hospital bed, barely moved, but continued to quietly snore without waking up. His broad chest, rising slightly with each breath, was exposed, revealing strong, well-defined muscles. Strong shoulders with large biceps looked impressive even at rest, as if ready to take on a challenge at any moment. The man's facial features, a clear jawline, high cheekbones were relaxed, giving the impression of serenity. Black wavy hair fell in soft strands on his forehead, covering one eye, adding mystery to his appearance. Lori smiled slightly, turning her head towards her colleague. Her eyes sparkled with a sly light, which Christina had already managed to recognize as a harbinger of some kind of joke. "He just got home from work, so he'll probably need some sanitization in bed," Lori said with a bit of drama, nodding slightly at the man. "We don't have enough junior staff, so apparently you'll have to do this." She winked and added with a grin, "Would you like to look at the stitches?" Christina, who had been observing the patient with professional detachment until now, suddenly tensed. "Of course," she whispered, not quite sure what to expect from Lori. Without further ado, Lori reached for the sheet. In one motion, she pulled it down to the patient's knees, revealing strong, muscular legs. She then used 2 fingers to gently lift the bottom of his hospital pajamas until the thin material stopped at his stomach level. The women froze. The room became so quiet for a moment that it was as if you could hear the air rushing through their lungs. "Well, this is, of course, impressive." Christina was the first to break the silence, squeezing out the words. Her gaze was focused on one specific area, and her mouth opened slightly in surprise. This is perfect," Lori drawled, leaning a little closer. Her voice became almost dreamy. "Well, you know, symmetrical and all that." Christina quickly shook her head, as if trying to regain control. "The seams are also in order, clean and neat," she said in a businesslike tone, trying to ignore Lori's mocking look. "Sorry." "What?" Lori laughed, covering her mouth with her hand. "Can you even hear yourself?" Christina, blushing, elbowed her in the shoulder, clearly trying to distract her from the topic. She then quickly lowered the hospital pajamas into place and carefully adjusted the sheet, being careful not to wake the patient. But even leaving the room, her eyes kept returning to the bulge under the sheet, and her thoughts wandered far from her usual work duties. Closing the door behind her, Lori was the first to break the silence. "Did you know?" Christina laughed, barely restraining herself from laughing loudly. Her face was flushed. "Well, the day nurse told me, but I didn't see it myself," Lori admitted honestly, crossing her arms over her chest. "But to be honest, now I understand what they were talking about." "Wow, I wouldn't mind looking at this perfection all night." "What are you doing today?" Christina asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. "I'm in the emergency room," Lori replied with a smile, clearly not planning to leave her colleague alone. What? Christina raised her eyebrows indignantly. This is unfair. I want to go there. Don't be late next time, Laurie shrugged, her voice sounding both innocent and mocking. This idiot hid my keys. I had to take a taxi. Christina clasped her hands, remembering the morning chaos. Her face contorted into a fleeting grimace of irritation, but then changed back to a thoughtful expression. Laurie, are you serious? Stitches. They're really neat, right? Of course, she answered, trying to maintain a serious look, but could not resist and laughed. Oh, Christina, you are just a miracle. Come on, go to work. Otherwise, you will be fined again for being late. Leave this idiot, Laurie said, confidently walking along the dark corridor. Let's have a drink in the morning. Christina started her night with the usual, filling out reports and making rounds with patients. The watch promised to be calm. There was silence in the hospital corridors, broken only by the measured hum of machines and the occasional sounds of colleagues' footsteps. All patients were asleep, and most of them were already considered stable after surgery. However, despite the apparent serenity, the bureaucratic routine required its toll reports had to be updated every 2 hours. She knew it was a formality, but doing it was no less important. The round was drawing to a close, and fatigue was beginning to make itself felt. On the last leg of the route, she stopped at one of the doors. There was a patient in this ward who had recently arrived. The man, who, judging by the information received, was a firefighter, attracted attention with his impressive build and courageous face. Christina quietly entered the room, trying not to disturb his sleep. The dim light of the table lamp caught the outline of his body. She froze for a moment, assessing his condition. The man slept peacefully, his face seemed relaxed, and his breathing was even. However, it was a professional duty to check the seams and make sure everything was in order. Carefully lowering the sheet and lifting the hospital gown, Christina carefully examined the treated wounds. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, but her gaze still involuntarily slid downwards every now and then. Something like a magnet attracted her attention. Dark spots were visible on the patient's tan skin, traces of past difficulties and burns that he probably received at work. But Christina's gaze did not linger on this. She felt her thoughts suddenly become unacceptably far from professional focus. Along his thigh, something could be discerned under the fabric, massive, but at the same time natural, as if sculpted according to the canons of anatomical manuals. Perfection suddenly popped into her head. She once heard this word from her friend Laurie, who spoke with delight about the ideal structure of the male body. Then they laughed at these conversations, but now she was no longer laughing. Christina quickly realized that she had lingered too long on this patient and tried to switch gears. "Wake up, Chris," she whispered to herself, feeling the color filling her cheeks. She hastily straightened the man's shirt and covered him back up. Pulling herself together, she turned away, forcing her thoughts to return to normal. "God, be a professional," she added quietly, reproachfully. Trying to hide her embarrassment, she headed to the corner of the room, where there was a cabinet with accessories. Taking a small basin and sponges, she muttered, "We need to wash you, otherwise the day shift will wonder why it hasn't been done. I can't leave them a job that I could do myself." Having filled the basin with hot water, Christina added a little soap, enjoying the pleasant smell that immediately filled the room. For a while, this allowed her to escape from her own thoughts. Returning to the bed, she lowered it to a comfortable height for work and carefully sat down on the stool nearby. "It's okay, just a normal procedure," she whispered to herself, as if convincing not only herself, but also an invisible observer. She began to carefully work with the sponge, carefully washing away traces of the day's dust and sweat from the patient's skin. Her movements were calm and confident. Warm water gently touched the man's body, as if calming him. Starting with his head, she gently washed the area around his eyes and nose. She had to rub her face to remove the dirt, but it didn't wake him up. Once his face and neck were clear, she pulled back the sheet and removed the hospital gown, placing it at the foot of the bed. Most of the time, she tried to keep her eyes above his waist while she washed his chest and armpits. His large, taut biceps made his arms feel heavy. She lifted each one to thoroughly wash them and remove any remaining dirt and grease. As she treated his body with a soft, damp sponge, Christina felt a growing excitement that she had not experienced at work for a long time. She tried to concentrate on her task, but her thoughts kept wandering towards something that was completely out of place for her. "That's enough," she whispered quietly, trying to push away unexpected feelings. She carefully ran the sponge over the area of the lower abdomen, where there were still stitches. This area had already been cleaned during the operation, but she wanted to make sure everything was fine. Getting up, Christina went to the door, opened it slightly, and looked around the empty corridor, where the dim light and the muffled hum of the lamps barely filled the space. "Stop it," she breathed, rolling her eyes, and went back to work. Noisily moving the chair, she moved to his feet and continued cleaning them with a new sponge. Trying to be confident and methodical, she washed each finger, ankle, and moved higher up his legs. When she finished, her skin was clean and a light scent of freshness filled the air. Gradually, moving up, Christina still tried to keep her distance and remain extremely professional, not allowing unnecessary thoughts to take over her. "It's okay, Chris," she told herself. "This is your job." The warmth in her lower abdomen grew, disturbing her with its presence. Spreading the man's knees a little wider, she looked at his sleeping face. His features were calm, his breathing evenly raised, and lowered his chest. She carefully lifted part of his body to wash the skin. Touching the warm surface with a sponge, I felt a barely noticeable movement. Working carefully, she carefully cleaned every fold, being careful not to disturb his peace. As she did so, she felt the tension building and held her breath for a second. The coldness of the room contrasted with the inner heat, which seemed to intensify with each of her careful touches. "You're almost done," she told herself, struggling to maintain control. "You're a professional." She took a new sponge, dipped it in hot water, and wrapped it around his body, thoroughly cleaning his skin. Her movements were confident and smooth. She tried to focus on her task. Water flowed down his tense muscles, exposing their clear lines. Her hand slid along his body, lingering on every detail. His chest rose and fell with each breath, and his face remained calm, as if he was completely relaxed. Christina felt a slight trembling, but quickly pushed away the strange sensation, focusing on her work. As she ran the sponge up his arm, she noticed how his skin was slightly red from the hot water. She handled each part carefully, not missing anything, and was careful not to linger where the touch might be too personal. Her gaze accidentally fell on the clock on the wall. There was an hour left until the end of her shift. An inner voice reminded her that everything needed to be done quickly and professionally. She took a deep breath to calm herself and continued. When she was finished, she carefully wiped it dry and made sure everything was in order. With a sense of accomplishment, Christina tidied up the place, trying not to think about her strange excitement. She just looked at his face one more time, making sure that he was still resting calmly. "Your call light is blinking," came Laurie's voice from the slightly open door. "Can you go?" Christina turned around sharply. "I'm just finishing up here." "Certainly." The door closed. Christina hurriedly took the sponge and began to dry the man. She tossed the robe and sheet into the laundry basket as his eyes opened. The man glanced at his naked body lying on the bed. "Hands," Christina ordered, holding a new ugly blue robe in her hands. The man raised his hands, sticking them through the holes. "Everything is fine," she smiled at him. "Yes, just. A strange dream, probably." His eyes darted back and forth. "Will you share?" she asked with a grin, covering him with a new sheet. Well, perhaps not." He smiled nervously. "Will you be distributing morning medicine?" Laurie entered, not taking her eyes off the man in the bed. "Right now," Christina announced cheerfully. "Just finished my bed hygiene. It's a pity that I missed it." The man sat down on the bed without taking his eyes off Christina. "Oh, you didn't miss anything." Christina winked at him. "Take care of yourself." She left the room, followed by Laurie. "Well, how?" Laurie pushed her. "Full care?" "No," she lied. "Only the upper body." God, I could wash this huge thing all night. Lori shook her head. Ready for a drink. It's 8 in the morning, perfect time. Right after the medicine. Christina answered, exhaling with relief through pursed lips. Nobody suspected anything. The next evening the clouds cleared, and the light of the full moon glittered on the wet asphalt, as if in a crystal cave. Christina pulled her hair into a tight ponytail, causing her dark eyes to narrow. She entered the elevator and ascended to the 7th floor of the hospital with 5 minutes to spare. She won't be late today. Lori stood leaning against the wall next to the nurse's station, drinking black coffee and staring into space. "You've come," she said without taking her eyes off as Christina wrapped her green stethoscope around her neck. With time to spare, Christina answered in a cheerful tone. "You're too cheerful for the morning. What's wrong?" Lori noticed the tension in her face. "Here's a note." Christina handed her a piece of paper. "He finally left." "Well, for now, yes, but you know, he will return. He always comes back." Lori said, spitting out the words along with the coffee. "So are you staying with me, or am I moving in with you?" "I haven't decided yet." Christina lowered her eyes and began to press the toe of her shoe on the white floor. An elderly, heavily built woman with silver hair in a wrinkled and soiled dark blue robe approached a group of nurses. Everyone immediately froze and turned to her, waiting. The head nurse began loudly distributing tasks to the staff one at a time, everyone except Christina, who stood waiting. Even Lori was given an assignment on the 8th floor, which was considered the best, since the more complex patients were there. "Maybe to the emergency room," Lori shrugged. "Chris," the older woman spat, turning her head and looking over the thin-framed glasses that sat on the tip of her nose. "In the dungeon." "What?" Christina exclaimed, not trying to restrain herself. "I was in the dungeon last night. Today it's someone else's turn." "All patients are the same, and you already know them," the head nurse snapped. "They are all simple. Don't you think my experience could be used elsewhere?" Christina did not want to return to the dungeon for many reasons. "Listen, Chris," Michelle objected. "I need you there. If there's a surge of patients in the again, I can send a nurse there to look after your patients while you help. If you stay here, I will have to cover your chambers. It's just logical." "Well, as you wish." Christina clasped her hands and headed towards the elevator. Lori hurried after her. "Maybe you can take that full bath in bed today," she laughed as the elevator doors closed, leaving Christina with a sour expression on her face. The old nurse in the dungeon was sitting at the computer when Christina arrived. She pulled out a chair next to the older woman and stared at the blank monitor screen in front of her. "Any changes?" she asked without looking at the old woman. "No," came the answer. "The night should be boring." "Wonderful," Christina exhaled sarcastically, then put her head in her hands and exhaled slowly for a long time. When an elderly woman in a long white dress trudged along the dark corridor, Christina looked towards the chambers. She didn't want to see that man from last night. She had made a mistake and wasn't sure she could trust herself around him. "I will avoid him," she thought. "If he sleeps all night, it will only be for the better for him." She walked around the first 5 rooms, making sure all the patients were either asleep or about to fall asleep, then returned to the computer and began searching the internet for something to keep her busy. "I need something to distract me," she decided. She noticed the harsh red light of a flashing light out of the corner of her eye and turned to see a call flashing above the last door on the left. "Crap," she muttered. She rummaged through the papers on the table and found his card. His name was Jim. Last night, she unknowingly did something too intimate to him, and she couldn't understand why. She didn't even know his name. "Well, he's a fireman," she thought with a chuckle. Maybe he deserved it. Besides, he doesn't even know anything. He slept through everything that happened under the influence of drugs. She stood up, straightened her red medical scrubs, and adjusted the stethoscope around her neck. "Everything will be fine." She took a deep breath and headed towards his door. The door creaked as she opened it and looked inside. "Everything is fine," she whispered without entering the room. "Yes, do you have a minute?" The voice was deeper than she remembered. "Of course," she answered. walking in with her hands clasped behind her back, which further emphasized her ample breasts. "How can I help? Can I have a glass of water?" He nodded. "I asked another nurse, but she seems to have forgotten." Seeing him in the lamplight, sitting on the edge of the bed, with broad shoulders and powerful arms, she gasped slightly. His face looked masculine, a sharp jawline and narrow cheekbones. His dark eyes seemed to penetrate straight into her soul. Last night seemed like just a dream to her, as if it had never happened at all, but now the reality of what was happening overwhelmed her. My breathing quickened, my face turned red, and my stomach began to swirl with foreboding. Her knees seemed ready to buckle under the weight of her body. "Are you okay?" asked the man. "Yes, of course," she replied. "I'll bring you a glass now." She walked over to the cabinet on the other side of the room above the sink, her face now pinkish red. "Are you the same nurse from last night?" Jim asked, tilting his head and squinting both eyes. Still a little vague. "Yes," she answered with relief. "I'm the one." "Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for last night," he said, picking up a glass of water. "Of course, we don't usually take baths in bed," she replied. "Usually the nurses do this, but there weren't enough of us, so it's no big deal." She threw her tail back, relaxing her tense shoulders a little. "Well, yes, and for this too," he bowed his head, looking straight into her dark eyes. "But you know, and for something else too, it really helped me relax." Christina's face turned white, and she took a few steps back. "Do you? Do you remember this?" The words were almost inaudible. "This is hard to forget." A smile appeared on his tense face. "It was amazing." Christina froze in place until the world around her stopped spinning. She tried to slow down her thoughts, which were racing at breakneck speed. "How could I let this happen?" she asked herself. "Should I be fired?" She grabbed her head tightly, trying to stop the whirlwind, then waited until everything around her fell into place again. "Yes, I made a mistake last night, and I'm really sorry. This shouldn't have happened." She looked at the man with desperate eyes. "Please don't say a word. I'll get fired or worse, lose my license." Her face was now crimson red. "I won't say anything, I promise," Jim assured her. "That's why I played dumb when the other nurse came in yesterday morning." "Thank you," she said nervously. "I know you can't do that, but I really feel better. I had these crazy thoughts about surgery in my head, and you just put them all away and let me sleep. I've felt so great since I came here." Jim stood up, his face scrunched up in pain. "Thank you." His voice trailed off at the end, then he tilted his head and paused, waiting for an answer. "Oh, Chris or Christina," she responded sharply, tapping her name tag. "And you should be careful." "Thank you, Chris. Could you help me to the bathroom?" Jim held out his hands. Christina tucked herself under her arm and carried some of the weight for him as they hobbled to his bathroom. She felt comfortable in his arms, as if she belonged to them. Jim jumped into the toilet, took her by the shoulder, and lifted her robe, exposing himself. "No, again," she thought. "I need to concentrate. This is my job. I can handle it." She felt her hands involuntarily clench, her robe sliding slightly over her skin. Jim put his arm around Christine and pointed at the wall with the other, as if something there was important. "Would you please?" he said, pointing to the object. "Besides, the doctor said I shouldn't exert myself." He said the last phrase with a slight grin. Christina smiled, shook her head, and slowly reached out her hand to take the item. Her movements were hesitant but decisive. She wrapped her fingers around it and turned it so that it was in the desired position. A sudden feeling of discomfort came over her as her robe brushed against her skin, and she bit her lips slightly. "Well," she thought, "I've gotten myself into a strange situation again." She looked at Jim, waiting for his next move. "Can you shake it?" he asked with a smile. "It's kind of like a man's job, but I can't do it now." Christina smiled and gently shook the item, making sure nothing else fell. "I assume you want me to finish this for you as well?" She raised an eyebrow, looking at him. "If it's not too much trouble," Jim replied with a grin. Christina laughed and complied with the request. "Here it is, ready. Don't ask for anything else. Christina lowered the toilet, then turned and sat facing Jim. She realized that the moment for action had come, and her decision left no doubt. Looking down, she began to work intently, completing her task with full attention. Jim closed his eyes, barely maintaining his balance, leaning on the wall with one hand, slightly straightening her hair with the other. Her movements were confident and precise. She brought the work to perfection. Jim could not help but note her professionalism. Every detail was thought out, and her actions were completely focused on the result. Everything around was filled with an atmosphere of concentration and dedication. She continued without stopping, her touch becoming more and more confident. Every gesture, every movement was polished, as if this was not just a job for her, but something much more. Her efforts culminated when she completed the process, proudly stepping back to appreciate the result. Jim exhaled deeply, feeling relief and admiration for her skill. "You exceeded all expectations," he whispered, looking into her eyes. Jim could feel the tension rising between them as Christina finished her work with a smile and a slightly playful expression on her face. She gently moved her hand, helping him relax, and carefully monitored his condition. "Are you feeling better?" she asked, looking at him warmly. "Yes, I think so. Thank you." He answered her with a slight grin, reminiscent of a schoolboy caught off guard. Christina straightened his clothes and helped him get more comfortable. Once she was sure he was lying comfortably in bed again, she softly apologized, informing him that she needed to return to her duties. After leaving the room, she methodically checked the other 5 rooms to make sure everything was in order. After finishing her rounds, Christina returned to her desk to complete her report. Everything happened in silence, as if leaving what happened in the shadows. It took her about 10 minutes to make the schedule and write the reports, and the rest of the time she could only think about Jim. He was about 4 years younger than her, but he was so mature, or was it just that way? He was different from her husband, who never seemed to grow up. It didn't matter, her husband was gone. A couple of years ago, she suspected that Dennis was having an affair because of the way his behavior and the way he treated her had changed. He always came home late, and they almost stopped having sex. All the obvious signs were there, but she continued to hold on, ignoring them, desperately wanting the marriage to work. She had never really enjoyed sex with her husband, but he always acted like he didn't care. She kept telling herself that sex wasn't important, but sex was important, maybe not the most important part of a relationship, but for a young couple, it had its place, and she had the same desires as everyone else. She had just realized, as her thoughts drifted between her husband and the man in the last room on the left, that she hadn't even slept with that fireman Jim. But somehow he had given her these pleasures strangely. He was stronger than any she could have given to myself. Was it his masculine, musky scent or his passionate desire for her? He said that she helped him. Perhaps that also played a role. She shook her head, trying in vain to get him out of her thoughts. She had never been with another man before in any sense. Her husband was jealous and always kept her with him, starting from school and even into marriage. His friends knew better than to look at her suspiciously, and her friends gradually pulled away, tired of his controlling behavior. Only Lori, whom she met in college and worked together, remained her friend, although Dennis hated her. He wanted children, just like she did, but Christina was secretly taking birth control pills because she didn't want to have Dennis's baby. She simply couldn't allow Dennis to raise a son who would become like him. "It's time to go around," she whispered. "Just popping in for a minute. He should be sleeping." Christina walked around all the rooms, quietly making sure that all the patients were sleeping. When she opened the last door on the left, Jim was sleeping without a blanket or hospital clothes, just naked on the bed. She quietly walked over and stood next to the bed, looking at his tanned, well-defined chest and sculpted abs. Just a few moments ago, she thought I was pleasuring him. Lost in the depths of her thoughts, she suddenly felt a light touch on the inside of her thigh. "I'm just making my rounds. You need to sleep," she said, looking at Jim with a shy smile. "I slept all day," he replied, raising his hand to her thigh. Christina felt a warmth as Jim gently ran his hand along her thigh, creating a feeling of intimacy that was new and exciting to her. His touch was soft, but confident, causing a storm of emotions in her. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to be completely absorbed in the moment. Jim leaned closer, his breath caressing her neck as his hands continued to explore her with tender attention. He touched her skin with such tenderness that her whole body responded, filling with warmth and anticipation. Christina grabbed his wrist as if she wanted to hold on to the feeling. Her breathing became a little ragged as a wave of pleasure, soft but intense, spread through her body. His movements were leisurely, almost studying, giving her the opportunity to experience every moment. "Hey, who's here?" A loud, deep voice came from the corridor. Christina seemed to wake up from a trance. Quickly pulling on her pants, she turned to the door. Walking out into the corridor, she noticed a large man, almost invisible in the darkness, standing at the computers. "What do you need?" she asked in a loud whisper, heading towards him. "You need to be quiet, the patients are sleeping." "Sorry, the head nurse asked to check if everything is okay," he answered, quietly this time. "Yes, everything is fine, I was just walking around the wards." At that moment, she wondered what her hairstyle looked like. Doesn't she smell? Is there something on her face? "Michelle is calling me, or can I go back to work?" Christina asked the assistant who towered over her. "Do you need my help?" he asked, white teeth flashing against his dark skin. "No, everything is calm," she answered, trying not to say that very word so as not to cause trouble. "Okay, I'll tell her," he said and quickly left. Christina took a deep breath, then walked back to Jim's door. She opened it slowly, closed it tightly behind her, and walked towards the bed. They stared at each other for a few moments before she grabbed the bottom edge of her shirt and pulled it over her head, letting it fall to the floor. Untying her pants, she let them slide down to her ankles and stepped out with her shoes. She stopped again, looking into his dark eyes as she stood in her underwear before unclasping her bra. Finally, her tiny purple underwear fell to her ankles, and she stepped out of it. She pulled out a purple scrunchie from her long dark hair and let the silky strands fall down her shoulders and back. Jim felt his breathing quicken as he took in Christina's gorgeous olive-skinned body. Her figure was beautiful, smooth curves, graceful lines, and feminine grace. She looked confident and seductive, and her movements seemed to radiate calm strength. Christina came closer. Her gaze was soft and mysterious. She gently took his hand and led him to the bed with a slight smile. Raising the head of the bed to a comfortable angle, she sat down next to him, lightly touching his shoulder. Jim hugged her, enjoying the closeness and warmth of her body. Her skin was soft and warm, and their touch carried something both gentle and exciting. They looked into each other's eyes for a long time, taking their time, enjoying every moment of this intimacy. The atmosphere in the room was filled with a special harmony where words were not needed. Lifting her by the waist, he pulled her closer, allowing her to feel every movement of their bodies. Slowly, almost tenderly, she lowered herself onto him, placing her hands on his chest. Their intimacy became deeper and deeper, their movements rhythmic and coordinated. Both felt warmth and passion fill them, connecting them in this moment. She felt a wave of emotions covering her head, as if everything that had happened before had become just a faint echo of what was happening now. Stroking his shoulders, she completely surrendered to this moment, feeling how they became one. He, in turn, carefully supported her, enjoying every moment of their closeness. Her heart beat so loudly that it seemed to be heard throughout the room. All worries and worries disappeared, leaving only joy and satisfaction from their union. This moment was theirs alone, and nothing else mattered. Wrapping her arms tightly around his neck, Christina began to move, feeling the depth of their intimacy. Jim supported her, carefully guiding her movements, their rhythm becoming more and more consistent. Every touch, every glance between them was filled with passion, their bodies moving as one. Her heart beat faster, a wave of warmth spread throughout her body, leaving a feeling of complete bliss. Having pressed her lips into his, she gave vent to her emotions, their breath mixed, turning everything around into a fog of pleasure and unity. When the tension in her body began to subside, she, still feeling him nearby, looked into his eyes, full of tenderness and understanding. This moment was more than just physical intimacy, it was a feeling of absolute closeness and mutual acceptance. "Don't stop," she whispered, clinging to him with utmost passion and energy. Her voice rang in the dimness of the room, and her eyes glowed with desire. She leaned closer and, looking straight into his face, felt their breaths mixing, becoming a single rhythm. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, feeling every movement, every tension of his body. Their bodies drowned in a wave of rolling intimacy, and their movements became more and more confident and harmonious. It seemed as if the whole world had dissolved, leaving the two of them alone in this boundless field of mutual attraction. Every new breath, every glance, every touch carried with it a raging wave of feelings. She seemed to be lost in space, experiencing a series of increasing waves of warmth and bliss, from which time flowed more slowly, and around there was no sound or light, only their connection. When the intensity finally reached its limit, they both felt how the tension was instantly replaced by a quiet but powerful flash of inner harmony. Their lips met in a deep kiss, full of recognition and gratitude to each other for this instant exit into another dimension. It seemed that the energy that passed through both of them was transformed into a calm, deep tenderness. She leaned back slightly, allowing them both to recover, enjoying the residual warmth that filled the atmosphere. Their gazes met again, and in this silent communication, there was no need for words. Complete understanding reigned between them. And suddenly, in the periphery of her vision, she noticed movement. The large wooden door at the far end of the room closed silently, almost imperceptibly. The echo of this quiet scene remained hanging in the air, a secret hidden from prying eyes, like a knot of trust tied between them forever. "Damn," she whispered, releasing a piece of the shaft from her fingers. "What?" Jim opened his eyes wide. "Someone was at the door," she said, hastily dressing. Christina quietly left the room and headed down the hallway towards the nurse's station. Her heart was pounding wildly, and her ears heard the loud pounding of blood rushing through her veins. Next to the computers stood a large shadow, a tall man with dark skin that almost blended with the blackness of the corridor. His arms hung at his sides, and his eyes followed Christina as she approached. She straightened her shirt and pulled her hair back, pulling the long dark locks into a tight ponytail with the purple elastic she wore around her wrist. "Are you finishing your rounds?" A familiar voice rang out. She recognized him as soon as he spoke. It was an orderly named Terry. Tall and stocky, he didn't look fat, but he couldn't be called thin either. Broad shoulders and massive arms indicated that he most likely worked out in the gym, although a small belly betrayed a lack of regularity in these workouts. She worked with him for quite a long time, probably about 5 years. Terry was a nurse who moved around the hospital, but was most often seen on the 7th or 8th floors. Christina lowered her eyes as she approached him, gathered her strength, and put on a smile. "Yes, Terry." She glanced at his badge to make sure she remembered his name correctly and felt a pang of guilt for not knowing him before. "I'm finishing." "Can I help you?" he asked, smiling back. His snow-white teeth flashed in the twilight. "I think I can handle it," she answered, raising her eyebrows and looking into his eyes. "Do you need anything?" "Well, I think we could talk about your attitude towards patients," he replied, raising his eyebrows. Christina's heart sank, and it seemed to her as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. She knew this moment would come, but she couldn't imagine how to prepare for it, or whether she could even be prepared for it. What did he see? What does he know? She didn't want to give too much away, even though she was pretty sure she'd get fired. Taking a deep breath and focusing on his dark brown eyes, she spoke. "I'm not sure what you think you saw, but believe me, Terry, I just—" Her voice remained calm. "Come on," he interrupted loudly in his low voice, causing both of them to look around in the dark corridor. "We both know what I saw." Christina crossed her arms over her chest. She needed to think. She would likely lose her job, but she didn't want to lose her license. Continue to argue or agree and try to persuade him. Taking a deep breath again and gathering her will into a fist, she asked a question. "What do you want, Terry?" She paused. "What are you going to do?" There was a trembling in the voice. "Well, we can discuss this today after work." A smile touched his lips. A sharp, painful feeling of relief ran through her. What did he want? Money? Or something from her? Maybe she should do something for him. Her eyes widened. Sexual services? Thoughts raced through her head. Terry was not bad looking, but the thought of doing something like that for such a purpose disgusted her. "I can't this morning. I need to meet my husband." She clenched her jaw so that her teeth creaked. "Then at work tomorrow," he nodded. "If, of course, you still stay here." Terry turned around and quickly disappeared down a long, dark corridor. Part of her wanted him to tell someone so she could deny everything. But if they come to an agreement, enter into some kind of agreement, maybe she can get out of this situation. The unknown was what was most scary. What should she do? What can she do? Christina finished her rounds and wrote reports in preparation for ending her shift. She never went back into Jim's room. She wanted to say goodbye, beg him not to tell anything, and ask him to deny everything that had happened. He most likely would have done so, but who knows? The waiting was the most painful. She decided at that moment that she would tell Lori everything after her shift, over a glass of something strong. She even wanted to meet Terry that evening, but she understood that first she needed to eliminate the consequences, and Lori was the best ally for this. At the end of her shift, she quietly entered Jim's room, watching him sleep, wondering what to do next, and left it, saying goodbye to the day nurse. She clenched her hands into two tight fists, tensed her whole body, and went to look for Lori. Christina sat opposite Lori in a large round box of an almost empty pub. There were drinks in front of them, but neither of them said a word. It was strange for both of them, even at 9 in the morning. Christina knew why she was silent, but why was Lori silent? She always talked non-stop. Maybe she knew something. "Have you talked to Terry? Did he tell her something?" The thoughts in my head were galloping again. "2 shots of tequila, please," Christina said loudly to a waitress passing through the bar with a tray of 6 beer mugs. The girl nodded and smiled back. "Tequila, right? You definitely need therapy." Lori laughed. "How are things at home?" "He still hasn't returned. And to be honest, I don't expect him to come back." "In a way, it's even a relief," she shrugged, staring into her glass. "Okay, you know how I've always felt about him," Lori agreed. "A real goat." There was silence at the table again for a long time. The waitress placed 2 golden shots in front of each of the women. They continued to sip their drinks without touching the shots. Christina's thoughts flew to Jim. He took her to places her husband had never taken her, or maybe he just couldn't. Discussing this with Lori would make it seem real, and Christina wasn't sure she needed reality right now. But she didn't have time to think. She grabbed one of the shots and flipped it, sending the entire glass of tequila down her throat. "Wow," Lori blurted out. "I've never seen you do that." Christina reached out and pulled Lori's shot towards her, without taking her eyes off her friend. Their gazes narrowed, but neither said a word. Then Christina abruptly raised the glass to her lips, threw back her head, and drank it all to the bottom. "Damn it, Chris, what's going on?" Lori shook her head. "I know Dennis left, but you need to slow down. We have work tomorrow." "2 more," Christina shouted to the waitress, raising 2 fingers up. "Okay, Chris, talk it out. Let it all out. I'll take you home." If only that idiot didn't show up there and start yelling at us. Lori clenched her teeth and pressed her lips together. Silence reigned again, and the surrounding sounds began to move away, as if fading into the background. Both women sipped their drinks and looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Lori was sure that Christina was worried about her husband, but Christina hoped that her best friend would figure it out on her own. Obviously, this did not happen, and how could it? It was just an empty hope. The waitress brought 2 more drinks and 2 shots, placing them in the middle of the table. They each pushed a glass for themselves, leaving the shots in the center. Plucking up courage, Christina reached out and wrapped her fingers around one of the shots. "Bed care," she blurted out before downing the shot and slamming the empty glass onto the table. "So you did give him this bedside care after all," Lori smiled. Christina nodded without looking up at her. "And Lori kept at it, feeling that something was wrong, but knowing that her friend would never do anything truly crazy. Christina continued to look down, clutching the cold glass in her hand and her eyes wandering around the table. Lori couldn't figure out what was wrong. In the past, Christina always discussed her husband openly, and this helped move on. But now she seemed to be avoiding the topic, which was strange. Lori froze, and then, as if lightning had struck her head, she realized everything. Wait a minute. Lori paused as the fog in her head began to clear. No, wait. Just, no. Wait, what? Her mind refused to connect the dots. Christina had always been the perfect, beautiful wife. She would never. Lori grabbed the remaining shot and drank it in one gulp. You couldn't. A sharp pain pierced Lori's head. Christina? Her eyes opened wide and she stared at her friend. What? Yes, was all Christina said. A fleeting smile appeared on Lori's face, but then disappeared, leaving her with wide eyes and a slack jaw. There were no words. She had never felt anything like this before. Had her best friend really done something? No thought or image could form in her head. It didn't make any sense. So, Lori finally spoke, trying to clarify the situation. Did you give the hot fireman a full bed treatment? These words seemed to help her collect herself a little. Did you wash his whole body, even his private parts? Christina, who had been looking down into her glass the entire time, looked up, met her friend's gaze, and immediately lowered them again, taking an unusually large sip. Okay, that's nothing. Lori tried to justify the situation, but something happened. She hesitated, not wanting to say it, but gathering her courage, she continued, well, maybe you helped him with your hand. Lori winced at these words. Christina looked up at her again, but quickly looked away. Not the best idea at work, but let's say it can be dealt with somehow. The main thing is that there is nothing more, right? Lori looked intently at Christina, who never looked up at her. That's all. Right, no reaction. Or, she grimaced again. Did you enjoy it? Her head tilted slightly and her jaw tensed. Christina looked up, bit her lip, and lingered a little longer this time, as if trying to gauge her friend's reaction. She felt like she'd let Lori down, and that was worse than making her angry. Her long bangs fell over her face, and she didn't want to move them. In fact, she wanted to hide behind it forever. After taking another sip, she lowered her eyes again. This was followed by a long, painful silence. Well, Lori sighed, collecting her thoughts. At least it didn't come down to sex. She tried to find something positive. Really, there was no sex. Christina continued to look into the glass, motionless and lifeless, like a stone gargoyle. Waitress, Lori shouted across the bar. 2 more shots. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as they drank in silence. The waitress brought the shots and placed them in the middle of the table and then left. Christina continued to hide behind her long hair, and Lori was lost in thought. Both understood that this situation needed to be resolved somehow, and most likely today. So, let's get this out of the way. Lori spoke first, breaking the long silence. He's hot. Well, just incredibly hot. I definitely wouldn't be able to resist. Just, probably not at work. She fell silent, waiting for Christina to raise her head and look at her. But it happened, and it's all over. She paused. Do you think he'll tell anyone? No, Christina whispered, slowly shaking her head. Okay, that's good news. Lori looked visibly relieved. Now it's time to cheer up your friend. Tell me, was that amazing? There was a long pause filled with heavy silence before Christina smiled a little. It was incredible. Her voice sounded high and light. Damn, Lori, I seriously heard angels singing and trumpets. Jesus, Chris, now you just have to tell everything, Lori insisted. Christina began telling her best friend all the details of the past 2 nights, without hiding anything. With every word, emotions and feelings returned to her. Her mood lifted, as if a burden had been lifted from her soul, and she found freedom. Neither thoughts about work nor about her husband disturbed her mind. She felt free again, even if only for a short time. When the story was over, both women picked up their shot glasses in the center of the table and toasted, laughing and chatting. But as soon as the laughter died down, the smile disappeared from Christina's face, followed by Lori. The good news is, Lori nodded, that hot firefighter should be discharged today, and once he's gone, you won't have to worry anymore. Yes, Christina agreed, but with a frowning face. It's okay, Chris. Just stop sleeping with patients. Lori said it as if it was something ordinary, making Christina laugh. And then everything will be all right. But there's something else. She looked back. Do you remember Terry? Yes, a nurse. Lori shrugged. What does he have to do with it? He knows. Christina looked straight into Lori's wide eyes. Looks like he caught us. And, Lori almost screamed, don't know. Her face returned to its former gloom. He wanted to meet me today to talk, but I said I couldn't, so he suggested we discuss everything tomorrow. If he hasn't told anyone, there's a chance he won't. Leave it to me. Lori threw up her hands. That's why you can't do such things. Christina slept well that day, perhaps thanks to the alcohol, which helped take her mind off all the nonsense in her life, or due to the fact that she told her best friend everything and, as it were, took it off her mind. Be that as it may, she felt lighter, as if she was entering a new stage in her life. The clear, cold night revealed the stars, making the air fresh and fresh as Christina walked from her car to the hospital full of energy. As she went up to the 7th floor to get her assignments, she noticed Lori standing in the open medical supply room, talking to Terry. The large orderly leaned his hand on the wall, looming over her small figure. Christina's chest sank with excitement. She shouldn't have gotten her best friend involved, she thought. Having received the tasks, Christina went to the elevator and pressed the button. To the basement again, Lori spoke behind her back. Yes, this time I didn't argue. She shook her head. Terry won't come near you today. I'll talk to you after my shift. The elevator door closed, muffling the last words. Thank you, Christina said into the closed metal door. There was a chill in the long, dark hallway that made her shiver as she walked to the computer where the old nurse sat, finishing her notes. Now there was one less problem here, which eased her thoughts. Yes, what she did was wrong, but she didn't regret it and hoped to move on with her job and license. The old nurse stood up and turned to her long white dress billowing around her ankles. Nothing new, she said dryly in her hoarse voice. Everything is stable. All? Christina's eyes lit up, and she felt a slight excitement inside. Yes, that's it, but what? The old woman asked with curiosity in her voice. Oh, I just heard that the man from the last room on the left was supposed to be discharged today. She shrugged one shoulder, tilting her head slightly in that direction. I hope he's okay, she added, trying to sound caring. He's fine. He had another MRI today, and the doctor decided to keep him in for another day to make sure. She turned around and shuffled down the long corridor. Have a nice shift, she muttered as she left. Thank you, Christina answered, sitting down at the computer, her heart now pounding. I won't go to him, she thought. He'll be fine, and hopefully he'll sleep through the night. At the end of the hallway, a fluorescent light flickered and buzzed. Taking a pen and a piece of paper from her desk drawer, Christina stood up and began her rounds. Each room was dark and quiet. When she approached the last door on the left, her breathing quickened, and a feeling flared up inside her, as if an angel with a golden halo and a devil with a trident were really sitting on her shoulders, whispering their insidious comments in her ear. Christina put her hand on the cold door handle and squeezed it with her fingers. Taking a deep breath, she quietly and slowly pressed the handle and opened the door. Jim lay on the bed, his large body motionless. The bed creaked softly as she came closer to check on his condition. She looked at his face, at his skin, evaluated its turgor, color, and capillary return, all of which she did every day or every time she entered the room. His eyes were closed, his breathing was steady. A smile touched her ruby lips as she took a step back. It turned out to be easier than I thought, she thought, turning to leave. You won't even say hello?" A deep voice sounded softly. "Oh, of course." She turned around, blushing. "I thought you were sleeping and didn't want to wake you." Moving closer to him, the corners of her lips lifted slightly. She felt nervous, although she had no intention of admitting it, much less showing it. She was silent, looking down. Trying to suppress the rolling passion, she forcefully pushed her feelings deep inside. But everything was useless. Her body was already burning, but now this warmth began to flare up like a fire inside. "We shouldn't," her voice barely sounded. Why did she let this happen? Why couldn't she say no? This all needed to stop right now before she lost everything. Right now, her thought screamed, but her hand, as if by itself, reached down and grabbed his wrist, gently running her fingers over his skin, as if encouraging him to continue. Her hips began to move in time with his hand, her breathing quickened. She did not notice how this happened, but opening her eyes, she saw that Jim was already standing next to her, continuing to caress her. His deft fingers undid the ties of her robe, and he slid it down her shoulders, leaving the fabric to slide softly to the floor. "Jim, we shouldn't," she whispered barely audibly, breathing heavily. He gently ran his hands over her shoulders, sitting her down on the edge of the bed. His gestures were careful and caring. She took a deep breath. The warm mattress felt pleasant on her skin. He knelt down in front of her, holding her gaze with his. His proximity made her heart beat faster, and the silence in the room emphasized every movement. He leaned closer as if he was going to say something, but instead of words, she felt his warm breath. He touched her hands gently, as if giving her the opportunity to stop him, but she only closed her eyes, allowing herself to momentarily forget about everything except this moment. "Oh, God," Christina whispered excitedly, leaning back on the bed. Her fingers gently slid into his hair, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a warm wave of emotion that took over her head. Jim ran his hands up her back, touching her gently, creating a cozy and trusting mood. Their movements were synchronized, like a dance that emphasized their closeness. Christina, full of emotion, threw her head back, allowing the moment to completely take over her. Their connection was felt on an intuitive level, as if everything around had ceased to exist. Their every touch was filled with awe, warmth, and sincerity. They enjoyed these moments, creating an atmosphere filled with love and trust. "You are incredible," Christina whispered with a slight smile, looking into his eyes. Jim, with tender care, continued to hug her, their sincere feelings saying more than any words. Christina took a deep breath as his long tongue slid into her tight ass. She grabbed her legs and pulled them back, freeing his hands. Jim squeezed her ass cheeks as his tongue circled her hole and then hit her every few seconds. Christina had never experienced anything like this before. It was both new and surprising. Her insides screamed mercilessly as lightning struck her limbs, and her limbs began to tingle. Short, powerful breaths now escaped her lungs, creaking with each compression. He approached her, slowly and confidently, his gaze full of warmth and tenderness. With a slight movement, he helped her free herself from her dress, leaving her alone with the cozy light breaking through the curtains. She lay on the bed, relaxed but expectant. There was silence in the air, filled with something unspoken, but very important. His touch was soft but firm. He took her hand and ran his fingers over her palm, causing slight tremors throughout her body. His every gesture was like a promise of care and love. She trustingly closed her eyes, surrendering completely to the moment. He leaned closer to whisper something in her ear, words that were meant only for her. She smiled, her face glowing with joy. The mutual warmth and sincerity they exchanged filled the room, creating an atmosphere of complete harmony. These moments needed no rush. Everything happened naturally, as if the world outside this room ceased to exist. Their hearts beat in unison, creating a melody that only the two of them could understand. Jim's growl became louder, and his steps behind him accelerated. His actions became more and more intense, and the bed beneath them shook. The tension grew, emotions overwhelmed Christina, forcing her body to respond to every movement. She felt him approaching his peak, and her consciousness gradually clouded from the sensations. Finally, Jim climaxed, his body tensed, and silence filled the room for a moment before they both froze, lost in their sensations. Christina felt the warmth spreading throughout her body and relaxed, remaining lying on the bed. Jim stood back, leaning on the edge of the bed, watching her. Christina lay on her stomach, her breathing gradually evened out. The silence of the room was now broken only by the occasional sounds of their labored breathing. Christina slowly rolled over onto her back, looking at Jim standing over her. He looked down at her with a wide smile on his face. Sitting in front of him, Christina ran her fingers over his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin. Her gaze was focused on his face, where calm and thoughtfulness were mixed. She touched his shoulder to get his attention and smiled. Jim, in turn, carefully ran his hand through her thick dark hair, slightly removing stray strands. His gesture was soft and filled with concern. She stood up and sat next to him, feeling the warmth emanating from his presence. Christina felt a slight excitement rise within her as their gazes met again. It was as if a small whirlwind ran inside her, but it was filled with calm and peace. Jim shook his head slightly and laughed quietly, then wrapped his arms around her, holding her close to him. They continued to sit side by side, enjoying the moment of silence and mutual understanding. Christina laid her head on his shoulder, feeling his strength and reliability. Jim hugged her tighter, as if promising that this moment of comfort and peace would last forever. "Thank you, Chris," he told her, still squeezing tightly. "Yes, thank you," she answered back and then pulled away. "We'll have to give up on this. I could lose my job." "Yes, I'm very sorry." He bent down and picked up her clothes from the floor. "It's time for me to go on my rounds. I won't be back soon," she told him as she put on her shoes. "Don't worry, I hope you don't get into trouble." Jim cocked his head to the side. "Me too." She smiled at him as she left the room. The dark hallway was quiet as she left the room and walked down the hallway. "Oh crap, I forgot my notepad," she whispered to herself, stroking her wrinkled clothes. She didn't want to go back to his room. She knew she simply couldn't. Christine walked through each room, checking on all her sleeping patients, then returned to the computer and began writing reports and charting. The dungeon remained quiet as time passed. About halfway through her shift, Christina heard her phone buzz and light up on her desk. She was just finishing her walk, again missing the last room on the left. She returned to her desk to write her report and picked up the phone. It was a message from Lori. "Can you come see me after work?" The words were followed by a smile emoticon. "Of course, anything on your mind?" she answered. Christine finished writing her reports and leaned back in her hard chair, her mind and eyes returning to the last room on the left. "I should tell him I'm married," she thought. Will this upset him? Would she risk him getting angry and telling the hospital what they did? She was already in too deep. Did it matter? His scent still filled her nostrils, making her groin ache. What this man did to her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her phone vibrated, distracting her from these tempting thoughts. She took it. "Go home and change after work. I'll text you when to pick you up." The message from Lori was cryptic. "Okay," she replied. Lori would probably tell her what they were going to do when she got there, she thought, putting her phone away. Maybe this is some kind of intervention, she chuckled at the thought. When it was time for her final rounds, Christina was ready to go home. She needed fresh air to clear her thoughts. She checked all the rooms except the last one, the one on the far left. She didn't go there all evening, afraid to trust herself. But this time everything was different. She knew. She needed to go there. She needed to tell everything, confess. Something inside haunted her, as if tearing her apart from the inside. Christina grabbed the cold door handle, slowly turned it, and quietly opened the door. "You're making a mistake," whispered the angel on her shoulder. "You know why you are going there," he continued to reproach her. "Yes, you should do it. You are doing the right thing," the devil shouted from the other shoulder. "You must do this." Christina tucked her hair behind her ear and looked into the dimly lit room. Jim sat on the edge of the bed, leaning on his hands, his head down, his taut biceps standing out against his body. Her legs were hanging off the bed, her toes barely touching the floor. She entered the room and closed the door. He raised his head, joy flashed in his eyes, and a smile appeared on his face. "Are you okay?" Christina asked, coming closer. "Yeah, just a little stiff," he replied, standing up and stretching his arms above his head. "Do you want some painkillers?" She suggested, trying to sound like a nurse, although it was surprisingly difficult in this situation. "It's okay," Jim responded, nodding at her. "I need to go to the toilet. Can you help me?" "I think you can handle it yourself," she laughed. "Today you are being discharged soon." "Yes, I'm ready," he said, walking past her. His scent filled her thoughts. "You know, I could use a home nurse. Are you by any chance involved in patronage?" Turning around, he looked at her with his brown eyes, which seemed to pierce right through her. "Ah, well, not at all," she hesitated, following him to the bathroom door. I, I wanted to tell you something." "Come on," Jim said, taking off his hospital gown without even untying the ribbon and laying it on the sink. He turned to her, his torso in excellent shape. The scar from the operation looked like a dull scarlet mark on the tan skin of his stomach, still slightly yellowed from the medical procedures. He leaned on one hand, his massive biceps and rounded shoulders standing out tensely. Her gaze involuntarily slid down. Christina quickly averted her eyes and looked at his face again. She cleared her throat to clear herself. "I," she began, her gaze darting. "I." This turned out to be much more difficult than she thought. She looked around, trying to find the right words, but her mind failed her. It was a mistake, she shouldn't have come here. The angel on her shoulder was right. "You?" Jim asked, raising his eyebrows. "Fuck," she breathed, taking a step towards him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "I want you," she whispered, their gazes met, and her fingers trembled from the rolling tension. Jim pulled the hem of her t-shirt, lifting it over her head. She let go of him for a moment to help him get rid of the fabric. Her long hair fell over her shoulders. Holding her hands behind her back, she took off her bra, revealing the soft contours of her figure. Jim leaned down, touching his lips to her shoulder, his breath burning her skin, making her shiver. He lowered his hands to the clasp of her trousers and, untying them, carefully lowered them down, allowing the clothes to slide to her legs. She shifted easily, took off her shoes, and got rid of the remnants of her clothes. Jim grabbed her around the waist and lifted her, pressing her against the cool tiled wall. The contrast in temperature made her shiver, but she wrapped her arms around his shoulders, finding support and warmth in his embrace. He brought her face closer to his, their lips met in a long, deep kiss full of passion and tenderness. Her hands slid to his shoulders, hard and tense, like hot stone. His movements were confident and soft. She felt their bodies merge, the harmony of their breathing and touches enveloped her entire being. Warmth spread inside her, forcing her to close her eyes and completely surrender to the moment. A colossal surge of feelings pierced her entire body the moment Christina pressed her lips to Jim's, not holding back her voice. She felt his presence fill the entire space around her, and it seemed to them that they were becoming one. A wet thrill ran through her skin, and it seemed to her that the whole world had stopped, focusing only on the two of them. Christina convulsively clung to Jim's shoulders, trying to stay in this whirlwind of sensations. Her heart was beating so loudly that she could barely hear her own breathing. From intimacy and passion, everything inside her pulsated, like energy concentrated at one point and bursting with bright flashes. When their gazes met, he just exhaled, "Wow," and she answered with a short, slightly hoarse, "Oh, hell." They pulled away literally for a split second, but even this was enough to realize the power of the moments given by fate. Jim carefully moved Christina so that she rested comfortably on the edge of the snow-white sink, as if on the balustrade of a palace unknown to them. Their movements became measured, but no less passionate. Every soft gesture, touch, every new breath rang like a thin thread between them, filling the space around with invisible waves of warmth and tenderness. Christina, holding the edges of the sink, allowed Jim to set the rhythm for their peculiar dance. The feeling of a tornado grew inside her, But now it was not an element of destruction, but of purification and connection. Her breathing became more and more rapid, reflecting the rhythm set by the two of them. Words fell on Christina's lips again, confused as the whisper of leaves in the wind. Ah, a little more. These words spurred Jim on, and their overall movement became even more harmonious, filling the surrounding space with the sound of their own breaths and barely audible ones rushing out confessions. As if hypnotized, they were carried away from reality to a place where every breath was a new discovery, and every moment was like a small eternity. The space around them trembled with the intensity of feelings, and their embrace became tighter, as if they were afraid of losing each other in a whirlpool of emotions. When everything calmed down and time seemed to stand still, their gazes met again. Surprise and delight were visible on their faces. Christina felt a pleasant warmth remain inside, and Jim, breathing heavily, looked at her, as if trying to remember this moment forever. There was a subtle aroma of intimacy and trust in the air. It was not just a moment of passion. It was a brief stop of the entire universe to allow the two of them to be together in a weightless silence filled with tenderness. Both bodies, frozen in a molten tangle of sweat and passion, intertwined limbs and expanding lungs, seemed frozen in time for eternity. Jim pushed off from the tiled wall, his tense body moving with confidence. Christina's legs slowly sank until she found herself sitting on the edge of the sink, her toes trembling with tension. She took a deep breath, wrapping her hands around the edge of the sink as if trying to find her balance. Sliding down, Christina stood in front of him. Their gazes met, filled with both determination and gentleness. She stood on her tiptoes, their faces came closer, and their breaths mingled. Snuggling closer, Christina wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his body, which warmed her from the inside. They remained in this close contact for a moment that lasted an eternity. Finally, she pulled back slightly, looking into his deep, dark eyes that seemed full of silent words. The silence between them was saturated with meaning, and Christina, holding his shoulders tightly, felt how reality began to slowly return, intertwining itself with this moment. She paused, realizing that this was her last chance. I'm married. Her eyes looked away. About. Jim stepped back, shocked by her words. Well, this is clearly not ideal. He looked at the floor. I mean, it's not just your fault. I need to be held accountable for our actions, too. Jim, Christina cut him off, pressing her fingers to his lips. He left. The color gradually returned to his face, and he grabbed her hand. Well, his loss, I think. He tried to smile slightly, but noticed the torment written on her face. I mean, he left yesterday. Christina was waiting for an answer, but there was no answer. It's too early. She waved her hands as if she didn't want to say those words. I can't do this now. I need time to think about everything. Everything is fine. Jim hugged her, holding her tightly to him. Let's call it a quick rebound. He laughed quietly. She squeezed him back, even tighter. She wanted this to be real, for him to pick her up and carry her away, solving all her problems. However, she understood that this would not happen. Her husband had just left a day ago, and she clearly couldn't think straight. She made terrible decisions, and sex with a patient was just the beginning of the iceberg. She chuckled quietly, but this laugh was not joyful, but sarcastic, almost not a laugh at all. Crap! She suddenly burst out when she pulled away. The shift is almost over. Christina hurriedly collected her clothes from the bathroom floor and began to dress, while Jim put on a hospital gown, mixing up the armholes. After tidying up her clothes and smoothing them out with her palms, she heard the massive wooden door of the room creak as it opened. Acting quickly, Jim put his arm around Christina's shoulder and turned them around so that they were both facing the direction of the bed. What's going on here? The gray-haired day nurse, who had placed her glasses on the tip of her nose, studied them carefully. Her face was stern, her lips were lowered. I almost fell. Thank God the nurse caught me. Jim's voice trembled. Apparently, I was dizzy. Christina hugged his waist, as if helping him. The old nurse came closer, looking at them closely. She took hold of Jim's robe, straightening it. Your robe is on backwards, she said, shaking her head, and walked towards the bed. What happened here? They were both afraid to turn around. Have you forgotten something? Did they get caught? Christina continued to mime, helping Jim onto the bed. Then she turned around, taking a step to the side. The old nurse stood in front of the sink, her hands resting on the white porcelain. The sink was torn 3 or 4 inches from the wall, and pieces of tile lay scattered on the floor. They both froze, their mouths hanging open and their eyes focused on the sink, which was held up only by the copper pipes sticking out of the wall. When I almost fell, I grabbed the sink. Jim quickly thought up. I think I broke it. Sorry. He leaned back on the bed, pulling the blanket over himself. I'll go call the technicians, muttered the old nurse, and, shaking her head, left the room. Let them figure it out. Thank you. Christina clearly breathed a sigh of relief. There was no more tension in her eyes. Looks like you owe me now, Jim grinned. You will repay the debt when you are ready. Yes, thank you again. She leaned over and kissed his forehead, but continued to watch the door. I have to go. She really wanted to give him her number or take his. Her body trembled with every step away from his room. The fireman taught her a lot in the short time they were together, a lot about herself and her body, but she knew it was too early to start a new relationship. Too many emotions, too many unresolved problems. The weight slowly lifted from her shoulders as she walked down the long, dark hallway, darkness engulfing the last room on the left. Christina took a glass of wine and drank it in one gulp, letting the last drops of ruby liquid roll down her throat. She looked out the kitchen window at the morning rain, visible only in the dim light of the street lamp, and poured another half glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. She worked the night shift for so long that drinking alcohol in the morning seemed natural to her. The thought brought a slight smile to her lips. Lori, she whispered into her glass, fogged with breath. If you don't call soon, I'll go to bed. Her friend Lori told her to wait for the message and then come to her apartment. It was important, she claimed, to clear things up. 2 days ago, Terry, a junior nurse working with them at the hospital, found her with one of the patients in a not very good situation. She had never done anything like this before, but it didn't matter anymore. The poor fireman she was pleasuring didn't even know they had been spotted, even though he promised he wouldn't tell anyone what happened. She told her friend Lori about this, and she vowed to work things out. Is this what she was doing now? And how? What was she going to do? They didn't have to work the next night, which was a bit of a relief. Leaning her hand on the windowsill, she touched the photograph of her and Dennis. She laid her face down, not wanting to look at this cheater who had abandoned her just a few days ago. The vibration of the phone made the wooden dining table shake. She picked it up. Come now, be quiet. Drinks on the table. Need lots of photos and videos. Remember, be quiet, the message read. Christina swallowed her wine, took the keys, and headed to the door. Lori lived only a few blocks away, and now she was curious about what was there. Christina's fingers gripped the cool doorknob as butterflies fluttered in her stomach and chest, tickling her from the inside. She felt as excited as a schoolgirl. What kind of surprise awaits her? Carefully entering the living room, she quietly placed her keys on the low coffee table and took the drink that had been prepared for her. Remembering her friend's second request, she switched the phone to the camera and continued sneaking around the apartment. She winced as she took a sip from her glass. Too hard, Lori, she whispered, shaking her head. When she reached Lori's room, she froze. Quiet sounds could be heard from there, but it was difficult to make them out. What was she doing there? What kind of surprise could this be? Christina leaned forward, letting one eye peer into the room as she watched the camera. The air rushed out of her lungs with a loud noise, and her eyes and mouth opened wide. She couldn't breathe and almost coughed. Her vision darkened, first at the edges, and then everything narrowed until she was temporarily blind. Inhaling loudly, she backed away from the door, pressing herself against the wall. Her consciousness was as black as her vision. She could not comprehend anything. She waited until her vision and thoughts began to gradually clear. Was it a man? A naked man? She muttered quietly. What was Lori doing? Her mind was now spinning in a whirlpool of thoughts. Leaning down again, she looked into the room. The shock still gripped her, but not as much now, allowing her to begin to process what she had seen. There was a man in the center of the room, his back to her, naked, with a tattoo of some kind of diving helmet on his right shoulder like the ones they use in the army. He was not tall, but not short either. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the white walls around him. He had broad shoulders, large, strong arms, and a rounded belly could be seen from behind his side. Why was there a naked man in Laurie's room? Why did she invite her if there was a naked man in her room? It didn't fit into my head at all. She needed to find Laurie. Just as she thought about it, she saw a figure kneeling in front of a man. Again, her mind went blank and her eyes flew open. Oh my God, was that Laurie? This time she couldn't even move, let alone step back. Sounds filled her ears as her consciousness finally allowed her to comprehend what was happening. Laurie sat on her knees, leaning slightly forward. Her movements were confident and focused, as if she was completely immersed in the process. One of her hands moved in the direction set by the other, creating a smooth and rhythmic pattern. The man standing next to her gently touched her hair, as if helping her maintain a given rhythm. Christina, standing back a little, raised the camera and took a couple of pictures, feeling the excitement overcome her. A slight blush appeared on her face as she switched the camera to video mode, deciding to capture the moment as she was asked. Laurie continued to work intently, sometimes casting short glances upward where their eyes met. Everything that happened filled the atmosphere with special tension, but remained surprisingly intimate. "Do you like it, Terry?" She smiled at him. "Oh yes," said a familiar voice. "Then tell me, Terry." She stood up. "Tell me what you want. Tell me how long you've wanted it." Of course, here is the adapted text. "I want you to finally tell the truth," Terry blurted out. "I've been waiting a long time for you to explain everything." Laurie's head bowed again, her hands nervously fiddling with the hem of her blouse. At that moment, it dawned on Christina, as if she had been struck by a sudden flash. She observed the situation, trying to understand what was happening. Terry, the same guy who caught her with the firemen the other day, was again in the center of things. She tried to keep the camera steady, although her mind was racing with conflicting thoughts. Well, she reasoned, perhaps Laurie wants to use this against him. But why? It doesn't make sense. Even if some recordings get into work, nothing serious will come of it. Of course, they don't encourage personal disputes between employees, but they also don't fire people for it if it doesn't affect their work results. Christina shook her head. "I don't think Laurie thought this through," she muttered to herself. Or maybe she came up with another idea. Perhaps she hopes to scare him by hinting that everyone will know about their quarrel. I don't know, Christina thought. Her head ached from the confusion, and her nerves were strained to the limit. She took a long sip of water from her glass, trying to calm down. Laurie sped up her movements, concentrating on her actions. The black sheen of the metal reflected in the light, creating a play of shadows on her face. Laurie looked at Terry's tense face. The moment was approaching. Her gaze was focused, and her hands moved with precision and confidence. Terry tensed his muscles, his face expressing determination and anticipation. "Now," he said, raising his voice a little. Laurie took a step back, watching what was happening with genuine interest. She watched every moment carefully, noting the details. Concentration gave way to satisfaction as the results of her efforts became apparent. Meanwhile, Christina walked around the corner, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. She closed her eyes, trying to collect her thoughts. Her heart was still beating faster than usual, and the tension she felt was gradually subsiding. Taking a deep breath, she set the glass of drink on a nearby table and smoothed her hair, regaining her calm. "What do you think you're doing?" Laurie's words shocked her. Christina's eyes opened, she looked around and was relieved to see no one in front of her. Realizing that the video was still running, she quickly turned it off and waited in silence for a minute before peeking around the corner. Terry bent over, his pants were down to his ankles, and he was about to pull them up. His gaze was fixed on Laurie, who stood opposite, as if indecisive. "Oh no, you won't leave so easily," Lori walked closer with a small smile, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. Before he could say anything, she pushed him onto the bed behind her. Christina, standing nearby, picked up her phone and watched what was happening with interest, holding it at the ready. Lori leaned toward Terry, her hair falling softly down to outline her face. She rested her palms on the bed on either side of his head. Her gaze was full of sparkle, and his was of slightly embarrassed surprise. "You know what you're doing, right?" he said, trying to hide his smile. "Of course I do," she answered, leaning closer to whisper in his ear. He raised his hand and gently ran his fingers over her cheek, lingering for a moment. The atmosphere between them became filled with quiet tension, but no words were spoken. Lori leaned back slightly, meeting his gaze, as if waiting for him to say or take the next step. Here is the rewritten text without intimate scenes. Terry gently grabbed Lori around the waist, guiding her as she slowly leaned forward. She felt every touch, goosebumps ran across her skin. His hands confidently but gently supported her, helping her maintain her balance. Lori leaned on the edge of the table, ready for what was to come. Christina watched from the side, recording with curiosity what was happening. She held the camera in her hands, trying to capture every detail. Her gaze slid over the figures of her friends as she searched for the best angle. She smiled, noting how confidently and harmoniously they interacted. Lori gradually began to move, her body smoothly adapting to the pace. Terry supported her, helping her find the right rhythm. His hand gently touched her shoulder to indicate when to pause. Christina, captivated by the process, continued to shoot, sometimes lowering the camera to adjust the settings. Lori and Terry smiled at each other, their movements becoming more synchronized. Christina laughed when Lori suddenly tried to change direction, causing a slight commotion. Laughter and friendly remarks rang out in the room. The mood was light and relaxed, each of them enjoying a moment full of trust and togetherness. Christina carefully opened the door, trying not to disturb the silence that reigned in the spacious living room. In the twilight half-light, she saw her friend Lori and her guest, Terry, standing at the window and animatedly talking about something. The furniture was moved towards the walls, as if to free up the central part of the room, and large exotic flowers stood in decorative vases in the corners. On a low table made of dark wood, covered with an embroidered fabric, glasses, and a bottle of red wine glittered. There was a light aroma of some oriental spices in the air, perhaps incense, the smoke of which lazily rose from a carved box by the fireplace. Christina quietly took a step back, hiding behind a massive screen depicting a mountain landscape. Her heart beat faster than usual. She didn't know why Lori called her today, and why Christina herself wanted to come early, trying to discreetly make sure that everything was in order in the house. Her friend was a creative and unpredictable person. She either organized musical evenings or invited traveling actors to recite poetry or took part in discussions about contemporary art. Terry, according to rumors, was an art critic, worked in one of the capital's museums, and was distinguished by particularly insightful judgments. Judging by their intonations, Lori and Terry were discussing some kind of painting or sculpture, perhaps a rare find or a recent exhibition. Lori's voice sounded alternately with excitement and delight, as if she was trying to convey to Terry her own understanding of some complex artistic image. Terry, in turn, spoke smoothly and thoroughly, citing dates, names, cultural and historical contexts. His speech was full of facts, but not without emotion. He seemed to be trying to convince Lori to look at things from a different angle, or he understood that Lori was eager to hear something that confirmed her suspicions. At a certain moment, their voices began to sound louder. Outside, two dull knocks were heard on the wall, apparently. The neighbors were making it clear that the sounds were reaching them, making it clear that an argument or discussion, no matter how culturally sublime, slightly disturbed the evening silence. Lori was silent for a moment and then laughed, almost in a whisper, apologizing to Terry. He answered something quietly, and they both slowed down the pace of the conversation, continuing to talk in a low voice. Christina stood behind the screen, trying to move as quietly as possible. She felt embarrassed to break into a conversation that was clearly about something important and interesting. At the same time, deep down, she would like to know what exactly we are talking about. Maybe Lori started a new exhibition or planned to organize a chamber evening, where she was going to invite Christina as one of the guests of honor. Or was there a discussion about the restoration of a unique painting that could become a real cultural event? Thoughts in Christina's head followed one after another as she tried to build a logical chain of guesses. Soon the voices sounded more restrained and calm. Apparently Lori and Terry had come to some kind of agreement, or at least a tentative compromise. Terry seemed to be heading towards the exit of the room. A slight creaking of the floorboards and soft footsteps could be heard. Christina heard the front door open and close. The silence that followed seemed almost tangible to her. She waited a few more moments before allowing herself to emerge from her hiding place. Carefully stepping over the wide floorboards, Christina came out from behind the screen and headed towards the living room. Looking around the room, she noticed that Lori was already standing at the table, holding two thin crystal glasses and a bottle of dark cherry liqueur, which was usually used for leisurely conversations about poetry or music. Come out, wherever you are hiding." Laurie's voice suddenly sounded, but not sternly, but rather with a slight smile, as if Laurie had felt her friend's presence from the very beginning. Christine shuddered slightly, but then, gathering her courage, she took a step forward, entering the dimly lit living room. Laurie looked at her with a knowing smile. Her look was more homely, slightly tousled hair, a loose silk robe in pastel shades, and light slippers. No feigned solemnity, just undertones that are in harmony with the general atmosphere of the evening. "I decided to come early," Christina began quietly, coming closer. "Sorry for not showing up right away. I didn't want to interfere." Laurie nodded and handed her the drink. Christina accepted the glass and took a small sip. The drink turned out to be delicately sweet, with a slight bitterness of spices. They stood in silence, exchanging knowing glances. Laurie seemed happy to have her friend around. Perhaps she wanted to discuss her recent interaction with Terry. What they talked about was clearly important. Christine sensed that there was something interesting here, maybe an upcoming cultural event, a new book Laurie was working on, or an unusual art project. "You probably heard part of our conversation?" Laurie asked carefully. Christina shrugged her shoulders vaguely, trying not to look too curious. "Only excerpts," she replied. "It seemed to me that you were discussing some kind of work of art or concept for the exhibition. Terry invited me to participate in a project related to a rare collection of paintings." Laurie took another sip. "These are ancient paintings from a private collection. They are being prepared for display in our city museum. He wanted to hear my opinion because I worked on similar exhibitions. But we had disagreements in the interpretation of the symbolism of some works and in the approach to the design of the hall. I probably defended my point of view too emotionally." "I understand," Christina nodded, listening carefully to her friend. "It seems to me that emotions in art are inevitable. Without them, neither the creative act nor its perception is possible." "Yes, you're right," Laurie answered, smiling. "Eventually, Terry and I came to the understanding that we needed to combine the accuracy of the historical context with a live reaction of the viewer. He wanted to make sure that the exhibition would not turn into a dry excursion, but would become a real cultural event. We went a little too far with the volume of the argument, but I hope the neighbors will forgive us. I promised Terry that I would think about it again." Christina imagined a new exhibition: dim lighting, neatly arranged canvases, quiet music in the background, and visitors slowly moving from one painting to another, soaking in the emotions, history, and beauty. She was interested in what role Laurie would play in this project. Maybe that's why she was called today. Laurie knew that Christina, with her delicate taste, would be able to give advice or share her impressions. They sat down on a soft sofa with embroidery in Oriental style, put their glasses on the table, and continued the conversation more calmly and extensively. Laurie shared details about the collection. There were paintings from several different eras related to local history. Some works contained symbols and allegories that were difficult to interpret. Terry suggested placing information cards with comments from art critics next to each painting, and Lori wanted to leave more space for the viewer to make their own feelings, only hinting at the main themes. Christina listened and thought about how art can speak in different voices. It can become a universal language, even if the viewer does not know all the historical or cultural nuances. Laurie's gaze fell on the small figurine on the shelf, an ivory carving she had brought back from her travels. Laurie said the figurine is a reminder that art is often born at the crossroads of cultures and eras, and it is important not to be afraid of dialogue. As they sat and talked, time passed unnoticed. The night outside the window became deeper, and the voices in the house became quieter and warmer. Christina felt that this meeting was important for her in its own way. She loved seeing Laurie like this, inspired, involved in the project, seeking the balance between historical accuracy and emotional impact. It was much more interesting and important than a simple social pastime. Over time, the conversation smoothly moved on to other topics. Literature they had been reading lately, music played at a recent concert at the Philharmonic, and plans for the future. Laurie thought about organizing a series of small creative evenings at her home, where guests could discuss what they heard or saw, exchange opinions and impressions. Christina approved of this idea, imagining how on warm summer evenings they would gather here in this living room, illuminated by soft lamps, with the aroma of tea, wine, or coffee, sharing thoughts about beauty. They sat like that for a long time, forgetting about the embarrassment of the first minutes. Now there was a confidential calm between them, as if the very atmosphere of the house was conducive to a thoughtful, unhurried dialogue. When the clock hands approached midnight, Christina stood up, threw on a light shawl, and apologized that it was time to go. Laurie, bowing her head slightly, thanked her for the company and promised to keep her informed of her future plans. Going out into the street, Christina felt the fresh wind touching her face. Behind me was a friend's house, filled with quiet conversations, creative ideas, and the possibility of cultural discoveries. It seemed to her that this evening clarified a lot, helped her look at her friend from a new angle, not only as a cheerful housewife, but also as a person looking for depth, meaning, and real beauty in everything she does. With this feeling, Christina went home, looking forward to new meetings, conversations, and projects that awaited them ahead. "Can I watch the video?" she asked, smiling. "Yes, of course," Christina replied, making sure the phone was set up correctly and handing it to Laurie. Laurie watched both videos while sipping her drink, a sly smile on her face, while Christina took small sips from her strong cocktail. She was already starting to feel like she was a little tipsy after one such strong drink. She noticed how sexy her friend was. Her figure was curved, but at the same time smooth and toned. Christina had never experienced attraction to women before, but suddenly she felt a slight bit of attraction to Laurie. Perhaps this was due to the fact that she had just seen her friend during sex, saw that very pure animal passion that came from her. Laurie looked up and caught her eye. "What?" Laurie burst out, her cheeks turning pink. "Nothing," Christina shrugged. "I just never noticed how sexy you are." "Is it true?" Laurie furrowed her eyebrows. "The video turned out good. It's clear that it's definitely him. Great job on getting his tattoo on. Just a little shaking. Was it difficult for you to watch?" She looked up. The corners of her lips began to lift. "Well, not really." Christina rolled her eyes. "It was even a little exciting. I knew you'd like it, especially now that you're no longer with that boring old husband." Laurie turned and headed into the kitchen, her panties cutting into her buttocks, exposing her tanned, slightly jiggling ass. "You shouldn't have done that," Christina said, following Laurie. "I don't know how this will help. Thank you, of course, but I'm just not sure there's anything we can do about it." She pointed to the phone Laurie had placed on the table. "Don't worry," Laurie replied, taking a sip of her drink and wincing. "I still don't think we can use this video," Christina said. "Do you think there might be problems at work?" She looked worried, her eyes narrowed as she looked at her friend. "You really shouldn't." "Chris, it's okay," Laurie reassured her. "He's been trying to get me into bed for years, but I wouldn't let him. To be honest, I even find him a little cute." "So you allowed it now?" I don't understand, Lori. Why? Christina shrugged, shook her head, and took another sip. Well, first of all, he threatened my friend. There was not a drop of concern in Lori's voice. Yes, and I appreciate it, but he can still tell me about me at work. Are you sure? Christina asked with excitement. But he won't. The corners of Lori's lips lifted. How will this help? Christina asked persistently, noticing how Lori was smiling. Oh, no one at work cares. Lori took a sip, then looked up at Christina, meeting her gaze. But his wife will definitely be against it. 7 months later, Christina stood at the window, looking at the bright morning sun. Taking a deep breath, she looked around the freshly painted house. New colors, new decorations, new furniture, a new ceiling fan that blew fresh air around the room, but most importantly, new life. She placed her hands on her rounded belly and felt a strong push inside, which made her smile. She hadn't heard from her husband in a long time, and with the divorce being handled by lawyers, he was becoming an increasingly distant memory. The changes in the house also helped. It was like she was getting rid of all the emotional clutter in her head. She turned the latch on the window and opened it, letting in the warm air that blew through her hair, when suddenly a loud knock was heard on the door. She expected to see Lori, and a smile appeared on her face. She opened the door and stepped back, her eyes and mouth wide open. She tried to take a deep breath, but she couldn't breathe, as if all the fresh air had disappeared from the room. The bright house became dark and gloomy. "Are you surprised to see me?" said Dennis, stepping over the threshold and looking her up and down. Um, well, yes. Christina squeezed out. "What are you doing here?" "Well, we're married," he answered, going inside. "I love what you did with this place." It took a while for her feelings to return. "We're not together anymore, Dennis. You left me." Christina raised her voice. "Or have you forgotten?" She paused for a long time. "The divorce will be completed soon. When were you going to tell me?" His gaze returned to her, sliding down to her stomach. "Tell me what?" She snorted, surprised that he could be interested in this at all. "We are expecting a baby," Dennis smiled. "I've only been gone for 7 months, and apparently you've been gone for about that long." "How did you even know?" burst out from Christina, who still could not believe that he was standing in front of her. "Clark and Angie saw you at the store," he shrugged. "I argued with them, but they insisted that you were definitely pregnant. I think we should talk about getting back together, for the sake of the baby." "For what?" "I mean, no, never." Christina took a step back again. He never listened to her, and probably won't now. "It's okay, honey. We can handle it." Dennis stepped closer. "Now, this is important." He reached out to put his hands on her shoulders, but she pulled away. "Well, tell me what it is." "It's a boy." A low, thunderous voice came from the corridor. Dennis's jaw dropped as a large man wearing only boxers came out of the hallway and stood next to Christina, right in front of him. Dennis was tall and big, but even he had to lift his head to look at this man, whose powerful chest and thick, muscular arms were still glistening from the water from his shower. The man's dark eyes penetrated directly into Dennis' soul. He backed away from Christina. "This is my wife, and this is my child." Dennis pointed to his big belly. "My name is Jim." The man extended his hand, but did not receive a response. Jim lowered his hand. "Well, you're partly right," he announced. "What do you mean in part?" Dennis was indignant. "She's your wife." Jim paused. "Bye." Dennis stared at the huge man, and a spark of fear flashed in his eyes. He backed away again, his gaze lowering to his wife's large belly. "What is he saying?" he asked, not believing his ears. "When you left me, I was so heartbroken that I probably wasn't thinking clearly." "I don't know." Christina shook her head. "There was too much going on in my life back then." "What do you want to say?" Dennis' voice rose towards the end and almost broke into a squeal. "What she's saying is..." Lori's high-pitched voice sounded like a bell as she walked through the open door and stood next to her friend. "What she's saying is that when you left her for another woman, she was so upset that she forgot to take her pills." "What other pills?" Dennis's face distorted in bewilderment. He opened his mouth and shook his head. "Oh, right," continued Lori. "You didn't even know that she was taking birth control pills when she was with you." There was a laugh in her voice, laced with pity. "Your wife," Jim interjected. "My son." "You can leave." Christina looked intently into Dennis's eyes. "And never come back again." When the door closed behind him, the three were still standing in place, a little stunned by what had happened. Jim wrapped his strong arm around Christina, holding her close to him. "Thank you guys for helping me," Christina smiled, her voice trembling. "I always found it difficult to stand up for myself with him." "You're welcome." Jim squeezed her even tighter in his arms. "And alcohol?" Jim and Christina both turned to Lori as she spoke, expressions of surprise on their faces. "Alcohol may have also played a role in you forgetting to take your pills that week." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.